Hello, fellow Rebel Capitals. Hope you're well. I am back with my good friend Robert Barnes. And, buddy, we've got a lot to talk about. Unfortunately, some sad stuff. But I think in today's day and age, with what's happening, it's very, very important that we discuss these things to try to figure out the best path forward, because we are living in a powder keg, in my view, a social powder keg that's just getting worse and worse and worse. So you're one of the clearest, deepest thinkers that I know. And that's why I wanted to have you come on and discuss these sensitive topics, but topics that I think are crucial that we think through right now and try to figure out that best path forward.
Absolutely. It is a disturbing time to see what we have seen in recent weeks in the United States and across the Western world.
So first of all, the thoughts and prayers go out to the family of Charlie Kirk, who I can't even comprehend what they're going through right now. So we want to be respectful of that. But I also want to talk to you about what you think the best thing to do is for people who want to see a decrease in political violence and people who value freedom, liberty, privacy, and all the things that I know are a priority for both of us. So I heard you speak with Viva the other day, and you seemed to be very sympathetic to the view of maybe adopting cancel culture. And I hate to use that term, but is that your view? And if so, why do you think that is the best path forward? And let me define that. I think we should compartmentalize an employer having the right to fire anyone they choose. I am all in favor of that. I've been an employer, and I think that I don't care if someone looks at you the wrong way, you should be able to fire them. But I think there's a difference between that and collectively putting pressure on a business to fire that person, or else, that person that said something that you might not agree with, no matter how despicable it is. So I wanted to differentiate. So what I'm talking about now is collectively coming together as a group to put pressure on businesses to fire people that have said something, let's just say inappropriate, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you have is, so you have different issues. If the government is your employer, then you have free speech protections, but that doesn't necessarily extend as far as some people may think it does. Then you have the private employer context, and what you're really describing is both the legal and political appropriateness of economic boycotts, because that's effectively what people are suggesting is a form of economic boycott. Say, if you employer keep this person employed based on public statements that they have made, then I will not support your business and will oppose your business. Now, in the union context, you can take it a step further. Civil rights context, this goes all the way back to the Montgomery bus protest. What a lot of the civil rights movement was, people kind of forget, wasn't so much speeches and marches, it was economic boycotts. That's really what moved the needle in Birmingham, was they decided, well, we're not going to ride the buses anymore unless you integrate. And that's what led to that effort. And then there was multiple legal efforts to try to suppress that, to say that the boycott was illegal. For the most part, you can join a boycott. And then you have like the flip side of it right here in the United States, and say the BDS context as to Israel, where you have an effort afoot to boycott Israel. On the one hand, what's that legality? And then you have efforts by, in some cases, the federal government, some cases, state government agencies, saying they're going to punish you and deny you federal contracts, deny you admission to college, deny you visa access if you are part of BDS. Now, this has got very...
What is BDS, Robert?
Boycott, divest, and sanction, which is the Palestinian movement against Israel, mirroring largely the broad BDS movement as to South Africa. That's their model. Is what, for those that may not remember, in the 1980s, massive boycott movement of South Africa moved the needle there to help facilitate reconciliation in the end of apartheid.
Right.
There might have been other issues too. South Africa was one of the most mismanaged governments in the entire world. And things, of course, haven't got exactly a lot brighter since the apartheid ended, sadly. So that's from a legal perspective. I think it's when you have competing speech rights. So it's like my right is like what you're describing: employer right to fire versus an employee's right to a job. Well, where do you balance that out? An employee's right to speech, an employee right not to be fired for any reason that doesn't relate to the employment. I have long been a supporter of for-cause limitations in the employment context. Because otherwise what happens is we end up with all these, hodgepodge of laws. Okay, you can do this as an employer if it's you, but you can't do this if it's like race or it's religion or it's gender or it's, in some liberal states that's drastically expanded. In some cases that's political protection. In some cases it's not. So you've got such a wide I used to argue that there was an argument when I came from a sort of more labor populist side of the equation that there was an argument for a for-cause limitation. But even in a for-cause environment, the statements that have been made in the Kirk context, I believe, constitute cause for an employer to fire. Because there's almost no scenario where the reason why I am considered cause in part is the broader cultural issue. And it's kind of like El Salvador, right? So I see it like that I'll be as big a First Amendment free speech advocate as anybody anywhere. But I understand where El Salvador was, where basically the cartels ran the state. At what point isn't the first liberty the liberty to live, the liberty to physically be alive? Where do we draw that line? I'm for as little state as possible. But when we have a situation where here it's the political permission slip that bothers me. So to sort of take a step back, what is
your political permission slip?
Yeah. So that's a good question. And to take it back a step, there are three main issues. Is that we are getting to a level of politicized violence in the United States that is the worst it's been since 1968.
Right. Yep.
So that's their concern. What is triggering that? I see it as a bifurcated situation. One is a coarsening of the political culture, particularly from the left, but not exclusively, but predominantly from the left, which says that words themselves are violence, speech themselves is violence, so that violence is a permissible reaction to disfavored speech. That I think at a certain point, constitutional liberty, the first and foremost constitutional liberty, this is the El Salvadoran president argument, is the liberty to be alive. And if something is happening in your society that puts that liberty at severe, substantial risk, then we have to assess how we handle other things in society in terms of employment, in terms of speech, in terms of other protection of other rights and other remedies. Like you look at El Salvador, they've decided to step back from full due process protections in order to lock up every gang member. And now it's led to a radical reduction of crime. He's the most popular leader in the world. The concern from a civil liberties perspective is where do you draw the limit? What justifies that in the first place? How do you make sure innocent people aren't entrapped in it? How to protect it? Same area of concern here. You want to make sure people get due process protection. But I think as a matter of general principle, there is no First Amendment protection federally. There can be state by state. California, for example, the Unruh Act. Generally, there isn't a right to your employment regardless of your speech. And if your speech puts a bad negative view on your employer, hurts your employer's competitiveness in the local industry, then your employer is fair game to terminate your employment.
But again, that's the legal component of it.
Yeah.
And yeah. I mean, I'm probably an absolutist from a standpoint of, I think if you own a business, that's your property. Your employees aren't your property, but your business is. And so you can fire them for any reason you want. And I would literally any reason you want. So, but again, that's the legal side of it. What I want to focus on is more so what do we do as freedom-loving people who value free speech moving forward to decrease the amount of political violence and is adopting basically the cancel culture of the left that we despised for so long. Is that the best path forward, looking at a cost-benefit analysis and looking at the trade-offs. And again, just to be crystal clear, what I'm referring to is us or people online that are freedom loving gathering as a group to put pressure on XYZ business to fire someone that made a comment that we deem inappropriate.
Correct. And I think the way I look at it from a cultural perspective is, would it fit the definition of cause for that person to be fired? I have no problem. To me, cancel culture, the most problematic aspect was that it did not meet, in my perspective, the cause standard. In other words, we were trying to say, because of your political viewpoint 20 years ago, you shouldn't have this job now. Or because you don't want to do something in terms of take a vaccine in your personal life,
Right.
we should take away your employment now. That, to me, didn't meet the cause standard culturally. In other words, even though I think there's an argument for it to be made of the legal standard, it's not outside of some contracts in some states. I've always liked it as a political principle. Is that cause to get somebody fired? For example, we wouldn't complain about if we think somebody's utterly incompetent at their job and is doing a terrible job and is hurting the employer, like they failed to deliver something to us, or they gave us the wrong thing, or they were rude and mean in the service industry, or they gave us the wrong product in the product industry. We wouldn't have any objection as liberty supporters telling the employer that employee sucks and you shouldn't have them, right? And so that's how I filter it. Is this about a totalitarian society that doesn't want to allow dissident speech that has nothing to do with that employer's employment? Then I'm opposed to cancel culture in any way, shape, or form. If it does relate to the person's employment, I don't have a problem with it. I didn't have a problem with it in certain COVID vaccine contexts. If the employer could show their job necessitated that person having the vaccine, then they were within their legal rights if they couldn't reasonably accommodate them and still maintain their business. I didn't think that they were required to accept religious objectors at the expense of their business.
Therefore, culturally, you would have viewed it the same way.
Exactly. So that's where I see here, if somebody's out there saying things, celebrating, supporting, giving this political permission slip to insane people to go out and commit politicized violence, they have given their employer cause for their termination and given customers cause to ask for that termination. So that's why I'm okay with it in this instance. It's also because of how deeply concerned I am with the political permission slip that's taking place. That if you study the history of politicized violence in the United States or around the world, but I've studied it extensively in the U.S., in the Ku Klux Klan in particular, you find that the Klan itself went up and down. It was, a lot of violence in the 1870s, then faded, then back again in the 1890s, then faded, then way up in the 1920s, then faded, then again in the 1950s. And what you find is two things. The people committing the extreme politicized violence are almost all sociopaths and psychopaths. There's no happy family that's the head of the Ku Klux Klan. It's domestic violence, it's long criminal rap sheets, it's long violence rap sheets, etc. So that's one key component, is you need a group that you can recruit from. There's a reason why Islamic terror cells predominantly don't recruit at mosques. They recruit in prisons. They recruit in jails. Right. Because you need the sociopath, and what I call it the political permission slip, because it's somebody with cultural power says, I'm going to give you a permission slip to act out that sick fantasy that's been rolling around in your brain. And maybe I'll even help with the means and mechanism of it, and funding and support and organizing, as appears to be the case in part in the Charlie Kirk assassination. But without the political permission slip, most of those lunatics keep the violence in their head. It will happen, but not at scale. It starts to happen at scale when they get the message from their local school teacher, nurse, medical official, lawyer, judicial clerk, politician, someone, but particularly in the school and educational context, that says, like, for example, just go back and read what media said between 2017 and 2020 that compared Antifa, a historically violent group dedicated to violence, compared them to the people that went to Normandy. Chris Cuomo did that, said this is what Antifa is. So what happens if, say, you're a 15-year-old kid in rural Utah that's already confused about a whole bunch of issues and starting to lose your mind? You see very people in power say joining Antifa is a good thing. Doing what Antifa does is a good thing. We support it. And it's that what's all of a sudden institutionalizes the politicized violence. And my concern is, unless we send a message out to everybody, there's a certain red line you can't cross. You can't cross the political, giving people a political permission slip for violence. You can't excuse it. You can't pardon it. You can't accept it. You can't embrace it. You can't wink or nod at it out anywhere, particularly if you're in a position of influence. If you're a doctor, lawyer, teacher, nurse, clerk, government official, administrator, professor, etc. That I think those people they're the key to politicized violence threatening the entire society. And I think that's enough of a risk that they have also they've given their employer and customers cause for their termination, that's why I supported it to them, that they fit a cause that can be for their termination. And because it's so dangerous, the degree is like, once this happens, all of a sudden you're in a real civil war situation. And itself was shocked. I mean, obviously, Charlie was a friend of mine. To see your friend murdered on national TV is itself shocking. But then you go on, and I even had extended family members, tell me why I was okay. Tell me why I was justified. Tell me why, I was morally horrified by it. But what made it more terrifying was, if you know that history, they're trying to use Antifa to unleash Ukraine-style Maidan coup violence of the 2014. Right. And what led to that? That led to a decade plus of war, basically. And so my concern is that this is serious enough, significant enough, substantial enough, dangerous enough to be worth a mass effort to point out these people have given their employers cause for their termination and to support it, because I want them to feel consequence. So we drastically start to reduce the political permission slip being given. If we reduce the political permission slip, we will see this violence recede and it won't take off and become a contagion. If we don't, it will be a contagion like you see in countries ripped by civil war. And what happens then is a nightmare of a situation. I mean, would we ever get as bad as El Salvador? I would hope not, but you could easily see that possibility. And then the second concern is unraveling these terror cell networks backed by these NGOs that all they do is go around and destabilize government. It's already been discovered. There's a U.S. government monetary tie here. U.S. government money went to certain groups in Salt Lake City that in turn were propagating the ideas of how to use violence to support trans purposes, and were part of the groups that were supporting, encouraging, incentivizing this individual to commit the murder that he just committed.
Right. I want to stay on this topic before we go off into the George Soros stuff, because I've got some concerns with this. And my first concern would be, let me actually just tell you the story of, when this happened, I was in a complete and total state of shock. I mean, I was horrified, and it was surreal. I couldn't really believe that it had happened. And maybe that's because, I'm not at Charlie Kirk's level, but because you're an influencer to a certain degree, and you're like, whoa, time out here. This is completely bananas. When Trump gets shot, it's like, okay, I get it. He's running for president. But when someone out there that's just a normal person, I mean, this takes it to a whole new level. So, but then I started to think about how to move forward and what there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs, but what the best approach is. Understanding that our number one priority is to reduce political violence and to maintain freedom of speech and liberty and freedom, the things that we talk about. And so when I saw people on Twitter that were gathering like 50,000 names because they wanted to basically dox these people, and they wanted to form a group and collectively go after that business to try to get these people fired. The first thing, honestly, Robert, it wasn't really a thought. It was more of an emotion. I was like, this doesn't feel right. Like this feels wrong. That this feels like we're making like a knee-jerk emotional reaction in a time when everyone is in a state of shock. And everyone is angry, everyone is sad, everyone is horrified. And usually that's not a good time to make a decision as to what our game plan is to reduce this. And another thing, when they started talking about cancel culture, that this is what we need to do, that didn't feel right either, because I have been pushing back against that for as long as I can remember. And that was one of the main reasons I voted for Trump, is because of freedom of speech. If we lose freedom of speech, and I get it, we're talking about two separate things with the legal, the Constitution, and then being able to say whatever you want in an employer. But if we lose the ability to speak our mind, assuming that it's in good faith, then we've lost everything. And as long we're always going to have bad ideas, we're always going to have bad people and bad ideas. But as long as you allow those ideas to be exposed in the sunlight, and then you combat those bad ideas with good ideas, to me, that was what I was always standing for, right? So that was my initial reaction, is like, I don't know what we should do, but adopting the cancel culture of the left, that doesn't feel right. And one of my great friends, Keith Weiner, had a tweet on this, and I thought it really kind of summarized the way I was feeling. And I've just got it written down here so I don't screw it up. He said, a lynch mob isn't fighting the left, it's joining the left. And I'm not saying he's right. I'm just saying I wanted to express these views and these feelings to you, because I know you understand history, and you know history a lot better than I do. And I know that you've got a little bit different view. And that's why I wanted to have this back and forth, because, maybe you can change my mind, and I'm totally open to being wrong about this. But then once I started to think about it, one of my first concerns was, who defines what is a cancelable offense, right? Like nobody thinks that someone should celebrate the death of another individual, another human being, especially someone who is innocent, who hasn't done anything other than try to make the world a better place, right? Like, you could sit there and say, well, should we celebrate the death of, let's say, Osama bin Laden, right? I would say I wouldn't celebrate it because it's another human being, but I would say it was justified. It was probably justified, right? And so you can't say that about Charlie Kirk. But my point there is, who gets to define? So, like, I saw a lot of people that are just, literally insane, out of their minds, unhinged, that were like dancing around celebrating. Okay, well, we can all say, any rational person can say, okay, that's inappropriate. But what about the person that just tweeted out he got what he got what was coming to him? Should that person, should we all gather and find out where that person lives, find out where that person works, and demand that person, not the person dancing around, but the person that just said he got what he deserved, is that appropriate? And who gets to decide? And where do we draw the line? Because I think, and I think you would even agree with this, that this does put us on a very slippery slope. Now, it doesn't mean that the trade-offs don't warrant moving on to the slippery slope, but I think we have to acknowledge that if we take this path, that we are on a slippery slope, and we could fast forward 3 years, and we, the people who are in favor of liberty and free speech, could be just as bad as the left was, and just as irrational as they're. I want to also say one thing on that I want to get your feedback on this. I think it's very important that we realize most of the, let's just say, lunatics we're dealing with on the left, I don't think they're insane, and I don't think they're evil. I don't think they were born evil. I think they were brainwashed. I think they were totally brainwashed, probably by our school system and social media. But, you go back to, let's just say, Germany in the 1930s. And you say, were those people truly evil? Was there some sort of DNA in the German blood that just gave them a predisposition to the horrific evil crimes, the genocide that we saw? I would argue no. It's this perfect storm of very similar to what we saw during the cerveza sickness, right? It's the mass formation psychosis, I think, what they call it. And we have to understand that whether you're on the left or the right, whatever you believe, we are all susceptible to that. I just think that a lot of what I saw online, and if we go down this path without realizing that we're susceptible to that type of behavior, we run the serious risk of not only making it worse, but being even worse than the people that we are trying to oppose. And I know that you've thought about this. So, and I know you're just as concerned about that as I am. So what would your pushback say? Or what would your pushback be on those concerns?
So I see this threefold. So one is that I think that as to the trade-offs, some degree of consequence to discourage, deter, dissuade this political permission slip people are giving to the violent is an essential public policy to prevent the escalation of political violence. But as to your point, the question is, how do you implement that in a way that does not undermine the very liberties you're fighting for in the first instance? How do you avoid creating something worse? How do you avoid setting up a precedent that can then be used against the liberties you care about down the road? And so I've been on the forefront of a lot of this for legal, historical, and political reasons. And the conclusion that I've drawn, aside from the first conclusion, is that something does need to be done in terms of trade-offs. That I fear that if people don't have some mechanism of, say, shaming and shunning, as I'll get into in a second, that they'll resort to more dramatic actions. And that as I want all this anger to be pushed into a direction that is least likely to escalate violence. So that's one aspect of the analysis. The second aspect of it is that this political permission slip is essential for violence to expand and taking it away to diminish it. Recognizing those two policy goals, to give people something productive to do that doesn't lead to violence, that are angry and upset about this, and to deter the amount of the political permission slip out there, some degree of consequence being attuned to those people promoting it, I think is relevant. The question then is the devil is very much in the details. How I tend to, what I want some hard line that prevents that slope from getting real slippery. And to me, the best way to do it is it cause? Imagine we lived in a world where legally that was the restriction. No employer could fire an employee but for cause, like some contracts and union contracts require. Does this particular behavior constitute it? To your point, what kind of behavior was it? How egregious was it? How do you know that person even did it? How do you know the context in which they did it? All of those are relevant. And to me, is that person a janitor or is that person an elementary school teacher? That matters to me, right? Like I could see for cause, the janitor's opinion on his Facebook page that nobody knows where he works is really not going to have any impact, is really not cause to get them fired. Maybe to keep an eye on them. I mean, someone that's celebrating death, murder, someone, you might want to be careful of who they are and what they're about and so forth, but that isn't really cause for employment. For the elementary school teacher, for the university administrator, for the university professor. I think that's what shocked most people is who this was. This wasn't like anons. It was people in their own Facebook feeds. And it was like the local production manager. It happened in my hometown at the local TV station. And I went through it because I was going to decide, okay, am I going to work to get this person fired? What's the moral basis for that? What's the legal basis for that? What's the political basis for that? And I was like, well, he's a production manager on media. He actually has real influence. Second, to me, it is for cause. If somebody that's producing news for the local community is celebrating the murder of someone for politicized violence, that makes them more of an influencer that's more dangerous, the fact that they're doing it, but also it's more related to their employment in a way that I think the employer would have cause to terminate them under those instances. And I think the public policy trade-off that we want people to focus on, it's the Amish tradition. And representing a lot of the Amish has been fascinating. Was like, how do they keep violence low? How do they have their public? How does it? How why is their health so much better than ours? Why is their life expectancy so much better? Subjective metric. One of the things they do is what they call shunning. So if you violate a very important value to their community, then they shun you for a period of time, including in employment opportunities and other things. You're effectively excluded. It's like the old exclusion that society used to have. Remember, we used to be able to expel people. Say, okay, you're such a problem. We're going to be able to expel you. You used to have cities of refuge that people could go that had made mistakes that were expelled and so forth. And so I see that expulsion from civil society in terms of employment opportunity is justified if it would meet the legal definition of cause if that person had cause in their contract. And that way we avoid that slope getting too slippery. And I still have cause as being a pretty higher standard than a lot of others would have it. To me, cause means it directly relates to the public policy you're trying to seek in having this be cause in the first place. And it is cause that really is cause that an employer could seriously suffer negative outcomes of being associated with an employee voicing this particular opinion because of the kind of job they were in. So I think if we go that path, we avoid getting like Pam Bondi, and she's up there starting to talk about hate speech again. And it's like, okay, only imminent incitement of violent crime is actually illegally impermissible hate speech. Now, I think some of these people have done that, but that's a different animal than the for-cause limitation on employment, and we shouldn't start mixing and matching those terms lest we end up on the slippery slope you're talking about. But we quote clear standards. What is our purpose? How do we limit that purpose? How do we have some strict evidentiary principles in place so that we don't go down that slippery slope of let's just fire anybody we don't like for any reason we don't like, because cancel culture now becomes the culture of the day.
Right. I guess the best way to ask this question is to phrase it in a completely different way. And I put out a tweet just because, in like a poll, because this is something that I was contemplating. And I tried to ask myself if, and I hate to, I don't even want to use the person's name, but it's someone that you and I both don't like, has bought a lot of farmland and and like part of the World Economic Forum, right? If it was the same situation with this person and a lot of the people in our space, the freedom and liberty space, were saying that he got what he deserved, would we be doing the same thing? And those people who said that, would we say, hey, that person should be fired because that reflects poorly on their business? And would we be pounding the table and trying to put pressure on that business for someone saying, hey, this person that is part of the World Economic Forum, they got what they deserved? You see, because to me, you can say, well, yeah, George, that's not the same, because Charlie Kirk was a really good person and that other person, they're a really bad person. Right. I get it. But now we're talking about just opinions as to who you think is good and bad. And we have to remember that the people on the left, these crazies, they saw Charlie Kirk. And I think this is actually the problem. I don't think it's the fact that they're, celebrating someone's death. I think the real problem here is that they actually saw him as a bad guy. Like they literally saw him as someone that posed an existential threat to the democracy or to the lives of certain disadvantaged groups in the United States. I think that's where the psychosis comes into play. But you see where I'm going with that. So not only do we have to decide what is an actionable offense in terms of what they said or how they responded, but then we have to also make a judgment call on who they're responding to. So how do you reconcile that, and how do you have a rule or a principle around who we should like? Another good example, I think, would be just when Trump bombs Iran, and we know that there's innocent people that died as a result of that. And it's not like you did this, and I know you weren't advocating for this, but a lot of people that are, let's just say, on the right were celebrating that. they're celebrating the fact, oh, we bombed those bad guys, oh, those brown guys that smell weird, that that have the nukes. So we got them, and it's something very similar. So how do you juggle that, and how you can see how I'm wrestling with this?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I have a strong disposition against the state having any tool of violence that an individual does not have. So I think the self-defense standard should be the same. Now, I recognize that that's not a commonly held view, that many people give deference to the state in places they would not an individual in the same situation. We see that in the attack on drug boats or alleged drug boats that is currently taking place, where we've got, two different drug boats taken out in international waters by the U.S. military. I personally, it's why I've never been comfortable with political assassinations anywhere in the world, personally.
Mm.
I don't like it when they're, like Israel doing their little beeper thing with Hezbollah. Well, you had no idea who had those pagers. Some cases it might have been, some cases maybe some innocent kid sitting next to somebody in a grocery store.
Yeah.
And the way which some people celebrated that, is like, I get where the anger and hatred comes from. Once you get to the point that you celebrate violence, even violence that can be used against the innocent, I think you're down the wrong path. Now, that's in part my bias, so people can take that as they wish. It's because of that I see celebrating, welcoming, justifying extrajudicial violence outside the context of war for politicized purposes as an unusual and unique threat to civil society.
Okay.
And thus it justifying, if the person's in a particular unique form of influential role in society, then that's cause for their termination. So it wouldn't apply to the janitor, it wasn't apply to the person cleaning, it doesn't apply to the rando on the internet, but it does apply to the third grade school teacher or the fifth grade school teacher in Toronto who brought him the video to show it to the kids and tell them he had it coming, he's fascist. That to me is for cause for termination. But you're right.
But it's because Charlie Kirk was seen as a political figure.
It's politicized. I mean, a general disposition of violence, any period. But
so if he was not a political figure, if he was like an athlete or something like that, you would have a different position on this. You would say, okay, I hate it. I'm gonna disavow it, but I'm not going to advocate for the idea that we should put pressure on someone's business for what they said about that athlete.
Right. It's that there's a red line of celebrating politicized violence outside of the war or state context that's uniquely dangerous historically in society. And that if you're in a position of cultural influence that shunning and shaming you is a important value in that context, that's worth the risk that you start putting into motion things that can get out of control very quickly, and you try to limit that by having really strong standards. That it's that you're celebrating, supporting, or welcoming the sanctioned support of politicized violence outside of the context of the state or war, and you are in a position of cultural and social influence in your position of employment. That you're using that position of employment to propagate politicized violence and to give this political permission slip that historically has triggered a wave of violence. I mean, we're already seeing copycats. The way this guy did it looks like Butler, Pennsylvania, a lot. So you saw people who tried to disturb different events. That's my bigger concern, is this contagion of political permission slip. And there we're only focused on a certain kind of crime that they're involved in celebrating or supporting. And it's got to be celebrating or supporting, not, I think gun control is a better solution, not those kind of comments or statements.
Yeah. Do you really think this will lead to a reduction as far as and again, we're focusing on putting pressure on businesses to fire people that said something that was inappropriate? Do you think that is actually going to reduce violence? And because here's where I'm going with that. Let's just assume that you have a position on genders, that there is only two genders. And let's say that the cancel culture, or the irate mob on the left, gets you, Robert Barnes, fired, or they take away your license to practice law or something like that. would that, after 1 month of you obviously being upset and angry, would you come to the conclusion that, hey, maybe I had the wrong position on these genders and maybe I should change my mind? Or would that make you even more pissed off? And you see where I'm going with this. If someone's insane or unhinged or brainwashed to begin with, I don't know that we're going to unbrainwash them by firing them and getting them fired and basically ganging up on them. I think there is a strong potential that we radicalize them even further, and this leads to even more violence because now they feel like the fascists are really out there. I'm backed up into a corner, and the only option I have is to fight back with violence just to save myself.
Well, I think two things there. I think there should be afforded where, in most cases, there's a reason why we have confession in various religious and cultural traditions. It's because there needs to be some path of reconciliation for those that have gone wayward so that they don't feel, as you point out, isolated and marginalized and intensify their anger against the system that can respond with violence. So and I agree with it, that concern is a definite legitimate concern. The way I look at it is, at least historically, when all of a sudden the culture, usually it's some cultural shock. In the 1920s, it was a Klansman getting arrested for sexual assault, but who was a highly prominent person. It's something like that usually when the culture says, oh, hold on, this is actually unacceptable, that you do see a radical reduction in the violence. So I am predicating it on, in the past, when there's been mass cultural rejection of politicized violence, we have seen a substantial decline in it. The second thing is, I want to give people who are very angry about this a nonviolent alternative right now, because my greatest concern was that we would start getting into reciprocal violence immediately.
Yeah.
And I was like, no, don't respond with violence. Find those people, shun them, shame them in the local community if they're really particularly dangerous because of their position of influence and their ideas, but focus on nonviolent mechanisms of dealing with the issue. Let law enforcement deal with certain aspects of funding it and organizing it and those kind of people that in fact violated criminal law. But that's the other reason why I think historically it has worked. I share your agreement. I share your skepticism or concern. This can easily get out of hand. And when Pam Bondi goes off and starts talking about hate speech exceptions and criminally locking people up, that's a very legitimate concern for people on the libertarian side to have, or free speech side to have. And that's why I've been trying to coordinate this in such a way to give people advice as to, here's a path that can work that doesn't jeopardize the liberties you care most about, or gives us at least the best chance of the best trade-off, which is what I'm looking at it from. And it's from the historical perspective that whatever it is, it's that political permission slip that's critical for these people to act out their sick fantasies. And for the most part, you don't need to send a message to everybody that's in that, right? You can send like 5,000, let's say 5,000 people get fired. That gets the message out more often than not. So that 90% of the people that did something stupid learn the lesson without having to suffer economic consequence for it. Realize, oh, you know what? This was too far. That's okay. Hold on a second. I got to rethink this. This has got to be a limit we all respect as part of our civil society. And I put it this way, I hope it works, because if it doesn't, I'm afraid the alternative is even worse.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I said in that first video I did when I was just in a state of shock, that you can see this leading to a civil war where it's like a Hatfield McCoy, or it's like something that we've seen in the Middle East for decades, where it's just both sides, right or wrong, thinks the other side is genocidal, and therefore the only option is to fight back with violence. And it's terrifying, absolutely terrifying, which is probably another reason why when I see people online, even if I agree with them, if it seems like this is stemming from an angry mob, I'm like, whoa. We got to pump the brakes on this one. We got to take a couple weeks off, take a deep breath, reconvene, and then let's rationally think of the best path forward, understanding that there's always going to be costs, there's always going to be benefits, and there's always going to be trade-offs. There are absolutely no solutions at all. I want to go back to the KKK stuff, because I find that really interesting. Do you think that would have worked if the university system agreed with the KKK, and if we would have had social media like Reddit that also agreed with the KKK, do you think that shunning approach would have worked? Because you see where I'm going with this. Like back then, they have no other outlet to tell them that what they're doing is right, or that somebody wronged them. The only thing they can do is reflect internally and say, wait a minute, this is another human being. And if this happened to my kid, I would be horrified. If the guy had children, a wife, these innocent people, it gives them time to reflect. But if they go to the university the next day and the teachers are, celebrating this, and they go to Reddit and the teachers are celebrating whatever they did, lynching, let's say, back in the 1800s, do you think it would have had the same beneficial effect to actually reduce that violence?
Yes, I do. At least from what I saw from historically. And it was whenever there was any breach in the dam of public support for this, it would often just collapse. And it would collapse rapidly. I mean, like views in the South on race between 1963 and 1973 couldn't have shifted any more dramatically. Probably best exemplified by the man who stood at the schoolhouse door going in front of a black church begging for forgiveness and asking their support, George Corley Wallace, which is what happened by 1973. 10 years before, he was right in the schoolhouse door. And it was because of mass cultural social pressure. And usually it's from people within their local community. It's someone they respect that's a teacher or somebody else who either gets a consequence. Oh, wow, I can have a bad consequence for this belief. But mostly it's recreating that Amish shunning and shaming, that if it's culturally broadly enough, people get the message. And it's fascinating because I was curious, like, how do all these sociopaths suddenly get in line? Why do these sociopaths stop being violent, at least for politicized purposes? It's to get the message that there'll be all kinds of bad consequences and the society doesn't want them to do it locally. That, like, the people who went and bombed that Birmingham church and killed those 3-4 little girls that were there singing Sunday morning thought they would be celebrated in Alabama when they turned around and were condemned by even people within their own political ranks. That all of a sudden set the tide went back the other direction. And I agree with you. Charlie had thought about these issues all the time, that he was getting some wrongful criticism of, well, why didn't anybody care about when the Democratic legislators were killed? Actually, Charlie did. Charlie was talking all the way back in April. He says, we're developing a political assassination culture. But Charlie also said, I don't want to lose our First Amendment or Second Amendment rights at the expense of trying to deal with it. So Charlie was always, he took the free speech path every single time. He took the Second Amendment path every single self-defense path every single time. And I respect that in him and being his friend. At the same time, I understand how this can get out of hand really, really fast. And at least the historical predicate that's worked, that is still consistent with liberty values, has been a cultural, social shaming of those bad behaviors of people in positions of influence. And the way I've tried to define it is, if it would be cause to terminate that person, then this cause of not encouraging a political permission slip is worth exercising that public shunning and shaming behavior in this very limited instance. But I agree with you. We should be very, very careful that we don't just let that. We've got to have strict standards, strict limits on this, or it gets out of hand very, very fast.
The problem is the attitude within the culture. We're assuming that that's always going to be rational. And it's not. I mean, let's look at the 2020, Robert. I think that there were a few people, a very, very small minority, that were standing up against the lockdowns, as an example, or the mandates. And so you could have said that, like, by me standing up against the mandates and the lockdowns, well, that is culturally inappropriate, and that people should pressure YouTube to kick me off of the platform. Or if I was working at Office Depot or something, to get me fired for my position on the mandates, or the medicines, we'll call them, the lockdowns, because that was culturally inappropriate. So how do you grapple with that?
That's where I think the key is the limitations of cause and the limitations of just this is what constitutes cause. You're in a position of influence, and like to your question about what kind of behavior, would it constitute incitement to violence legally? So saying, for example, it was justified if you're a university professor probably could constitute incitement to violence. So if it's incitement to violence, you're in a position of influence that could you could help create that outcome. That's what I mean by a position of influence. Then it's cause to have your employment terminated. And this particular cause of a political permission slip on politicized violence is worth it to bring down the temperature across the board. Also, I think the part that a lot of people haven't looked at is I'm also looking at people who are really angry and want to do something. Well, I think we've got to give them a channel where they feel that they can have.
On which side, Robert, are you talking about? People who are angry on the right or the left?
People are angry on the right. In other words, that a lot of people on the right are like, hey, we've been dealing with this for a decade now. You walk out in a Trump rally and they throw eggs at you, like that woman in San Jose, California. Or they beat you up or assault you. They dealt with it in BLM riots and the summer peace riots of 2020. They dealt with, as you point, during the COVID context. They dealt with the weaponization of the entire legal system by the Biden administration. The irony was the Biden administration was confessing we had a problem, that there's a small group of people that are being radicalized online towards politicized violence. It just wasn't on the right. It was on the left far more than it was on the right. It was like their warnings about their own corruption by saying, look at all these horrible things Donald Trump did. And they were just giving a confession, a biography of Hunter Biden's life story. So there's some aspect of that there. I share entirely the limitation libertarians want on this to make sure it doesn't get out of hand. I do think it's just unusual. Historically, politicized violence takes off when people in power say it's okay at some level. And so I want to discourage people in that position from saying it's okay. So to reduce the violence. And I want to give a channel for people that are very angry and upset, a nonviolent channel for their political expression of anger at those people that help facilitate this in the first instance, without jeopardizing First or Second Amendment liberty. And you're absolutely right. It's very tricky. It's very treacherous. And the trade-offs are hardly anything but easy, to be easy. But I think they're worth it and unfortunately necessary because of the Charlie Kirk murder was itself a turning point. His organization was called Turning Point. But it's going to be a turning point for good or bad for America. Either we're going to get back to recognizing we don't murder people because of their speech and beliefs in the country, or we're going to get into a civil war environment. And the latter terrifies me as much as anything.
Yeah. In all my 52 years, I've never seen anything. I'm sure it's happened before in the United States, but like you said, in the late 60s, I know the emotions were high and it was crazy, crazy stuff. But I have never had to really, but then I never had to grapple with anything like the cerveza sickness either. And I think back then, in reflecting on my positions that were by no means popular, even on my YouTube channel at the very beginning, once we got into the summer of 2020, it became a little more obvious what was going on. But right at the beginning, a lot of the views I had were not popular at all, even with freedom and liberty-minded people. But and it was tough because I was a public figure and I was going on podcasts. I was giving my opinions on what we should and shouldn't do. And I felt a huge responsibility. But the conclusion I came to is I always have to default back to my principles. And my principles are that the government should stay out of it. And it's your personal property. And if you want to run your business, you should be able to. And if you want to walk outside, you should be able to. And that's not a decision the government, or that's not a power that we should afford the government. And they should disclose everything, but they should let us make our own decision. And that turned out. And every time in Russia, Ukraine, the exact same thing. When there was just this angry mob and just lashing out at every single Russian person that they should get doxxed, or, we wanted to fire all the Russian players from the NHL or something like that. And it was the same type of hysteria. And back then, you got to pump the brakes. And I took a very unpopular position that we should not be firing these Russian people just for being Russian. And that, in hindsight, that was the correct decision. So I'm just trying to grapple with this, thinking about how do I take a principled approach where there's defined rules, where I'm not just relying on how I feel that morning, and if I feel like this is wrong or I feel like that is right, because then you really take another step down that slippery slope. But I think I really like what you're saying, that we've got to compartmentalize things, and we have to look at what has worked in the past. I listened to a bit of your interview with Viva, and where you mentioned the KKK, and I thought that was fascinating because I did not know that, and so that gave me another vantage point. And then I guess it's the whole political component of this, and that's where we have to put our foot down. That's where we have to draw the line in the sand. I guess even after this conversation, although I totally see where you're coming from, and you've given me a lot to think about, I'm still extremely concerned about who gets to choose what is inappropriate speech culturally that would warrant someone being fired, and where do we draw that line? And you know, if you were the guy that was in charge of drawing that line, I wouldn't be so concerned. But unfortunately, the way we're hardwired as human beings, whether we're on the left or on the right, we are predisposed to being emotional creatures and to being irrational. And I just, if we're allowing the decision making process to be an angry mob, I don't see how that ends well, whether the angry mob is on the left or on the right. And one other thing I'll say is, and another thing I've been grappling with is, I don't know that, or maybe we should have different principles for individuals who deal with kids. You know, Milton Friedman was, a free market libertarian guy, but he always drew the line at children. Like if children are doing something, you've got to step in and prevent them from doing that. And maybe that is something that, if a teacher is displaying just this gross, disgusting type of behavior, maybe that's a lot different than someone at Home Depot doing it, to where if that person at Home Depot that's helping you find a 2x4, if they celebrated the death of an innocent person, or if that person has openly said that they hate people that look like you or that have your beliefs, I wouldn't be overly concerned with that. But if it was someone that was teaching my kid, I totally get it. And that's some of the pushback that I got on Twitter, that I can empathize, I can sympathize. I think that's a very, very valid concern. So I don't know. Those are just my thoughts. Do you have any other comments, Robert?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That was focus on people with influence over children, and focus on statements that could constitute, if we were looking at it legally, incitement to violence of a vulnerable crowd. Like, that should be our that's what we're really bothered and concerned with. Someone having a difference of opinion, somebody hating Charlie Kirk, that's within their rights. What's not is somebody having influence over a 15-year-old and telling and encouraging them, incentivizing them, inciting them to violence. And what's nice is we have a reasonable, like, for the constitutional standard requires the incitement also be imminent of lawless action. And I think that's appropriate from a First Amendment perspective, as if the government is the employer. But if the government is not the employer, I think just incitement, if they have influence over vulnerable audiences such as children, is, I think, a sufficient standard that could fit both the traditional understanding of cause limitations on employment termination and within the broader liberty interests that we're worried about eroding in the name of protecting liberty. Because you don't honor Charlie Kirk by doing what Charlie Kirk himself never would have done.
Right. I think that's very well said. So we can go ahead and leave it there. I mean, I would love to talk another 2 or 3 hours on this subject, because I think it's that important. And I haven't made up my mind one way or the other. I don't think one conclusion I have come to, though, is the correct path. I don't know that I can take a 100% principled approach on this one. I think there might have to be some latitude for decision making, which I don't like, but I think that might be what the situation calls for. Going back to what you were originally saying with El Salvador. But again, thank you very much for giving me food for thought. That's why I wanted you to come on and push back against some of my ideas. And I don't know that I've made up my mind, but I think the key here is that we all try to take a deep breath. We all try to pump the brakes. We understand that mob rule, whether it's right, wrong, left, or right, is not the path forward. And that we need to think about these things very, very carefully, because whatever we choose for the best path forward, we're likely going to be playing with fire.
Yeah. And I think fundamentally, to your point, we need to re-examine our entire public educational system.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But then one more question, Robert. Would you go so far as to the Reddit thing? Because I think, the social media component of this, as far as radicalizing these vulnerable individuals, is just as guilty, let's say, as the university system. So keeping our principles as libertarians and people who value free speech and don't think, well, I don't want to reiterate everything we said in this conversation, but how do you tackle that? Because I think we have to take a two-pronged approach here. And is it just with better ideas on Reddit?
Yeah, well, I think the interesting thing here is the left's kind of opened the door dangerously, because like take Reddit. Reddit's banned all kinds of people in the past, so for far less. And so they set up a pattern where they at least created the perception in the customer world that if something was truly dangerous, they would not be promoting it, posting it, or platforming it. And now we discover that had a very political preference. Is there any fallout for that for them?
Right.
And then a lot of these people, they said that if Alex Jones even talked about it, he could be sued into oblivion by anybody with the most tangential connection to the controversy. Well, if we're going to use the Alex Jones standard, there's not going to be a media left in 5 years that won't be bankrupt, because so many of them are culpable and complicit in facilitating this, promoting this, incentivizing this, in the same way that Hollywood helped. It was Hollywood that helped recreate the Klan. 1919, D.W. Griffith, Birth of a Nation, first movie ever shown in the White House, glamorized the Ku Klux Klan.
Really?
The moment that happened, boom, Klan takes it to its newest heights ever from 1920 to 1925. That's how you get, in Oklahoma and Tulsa, the Black Wall Street burned to the ground. And it's because I studied in great detail that I was deeply concerned. I was like, well, there is a path here that if we're very careful about how we go about it, we can reduce the risk of the worst possible outcome. But we have to be very careful about it. And more fundamentally, we just need to restructure public education, because that's the origin and root of all of this is public miseducation.
Yeah, that's right. Then if you can turn the culture, you can then turn around the teachers, then turn around the school system. And that, unfortunately, is a very, very long-term solution. But that is what we should all hope for.
Exactly.
Yeah, Robert, thank you again, buddy. I don't know that we've come to any definitive conclusions, but we've given people a lot of good stuff to think about. And at the very least, hopefully we've encouraged them to use a lot more rational and critical thinking, and a lot more trade-off type of thinking, and a lot less emotion.
Exactly.
How can people find out more about what you do?
Sure. The vivabarneslaw.locals.com is where everybody gets together. We share. It's a great community. People share their own ideas. We've had this exact debate going on there. Where's the limits? How do we draw the limits? What rules do we set up? How do we redirect things? How do you be productive? I always say, when facing the dark, look for the light. And right now we're facing a deep darkness, and we need to look for the light out, not join the darkness.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, buddy. Thank you for your time. Can't wait to talk to you soon.
Thanks a lot.